They say a story can change with one sentence, and one sentence from a parent can reopen a case that has lived in waiting for years. Hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell so you'll get first-hand updates on this story and any verified developments as soon as they're available. Summer Wells vanished June 15th, 2021, from her rural Tennessee home, sparking an extensive but ultimately fruitless search. On the afternoon and evening of June 15th, 2021, the life of a small family and the peace of a rural community were upended when 5-year-old Summer Wells was reported missing from the family property on Ben Hill Road in Hawkins County, Tennessee. The basic fact, a child last seen at home who could not be located despite immediate, large-scale efforts, is the anchor for every line of inquiry that followed. In the immediate hours, local deputies, state investigators, and volunteer searchers spread out across wood lines, creeks, and private land, using scent dogs, ATVs, drones, and boats where the rain allowed. Flyers went up. Alerts circulated. Local and national media told the story of a little girl who had been with family members earlier in the day and then could not be found when someone went to check on her. That initial mobilization was total in its urgency and scope, but the results were heartbreakingly inconclusive. No body recovered, no trace conclusively linked to a path of travel, and no single, irrefutable sighting that placed Summer beyond the scene. That unresolved gap is why every new statement, every memory resurfaced, and every gesture from a family member gains instant significance. When the physical record is thin, human testimony becomes a canvas on which the community and investigators must work. The search that followed in the months afterward produced thousands of tips, repeated rechecks of terrain, and a long-running public conversation about what could explain a child's sudden absence from a family home. Over time, as initial leads cooled and the case moved into long-term follow-up, the community and online observers kept returning to the same hard questions. Who last saw her? What were the precise minutes when she disappeared? And which small, overlooked detail might be the thread that unravels a mystery? Those questions framed the environment in which subsequent public statements, including those by immediate family, would be scrutinized. In missing child work, the first day is often determinative. Yet when the first-day evidence is inconclusive, the decades that follow depend on the steady persistence of investigators, the occasional emergence of corroborating tips, and, sometimes, a family member's memory that arrives late but proves decisive. The case remains officially active, and authorities continue to encourage verifiable tips rather than rumor-driven speculation. Candus. Wells's timeline repeatedly changes, sometimes 2 minutes, sometimes 5, creating doubt about her credibility. One of the most disorienting patterns that has occupied public attention since June 2021 is a variation in how Candus, often rendered in reporting as Candus, Wells, Summer's mother, has narrated the critical minutes on that day. In interviews, public statements, and social posts over months, small but consequential details about when certain family members were where, when doors or gates were secured, and how long certain gaps lasted have shifted. One account might say that a child was missing for 2 minutes before someone noticed. Another recounting expands that gap to 5 minutes or more. To a member of the public, 2 or 3 minutes may seem trivial. In an active missing child investigation, the exact length of a window matters enormously. Investigators model search strategies, canvass routes, and prioritize potential witnesses based on those tiny time slices. When a primary witness, in this case a parent, gives varying minute count at different times, it complicates a forensic reconstruction that detectives must assemble. It's important, though, to unpack what changes in timeline mean in real human terms. Memory is reconstructive. People under stress can remember sequences differently, conflate events, or attach confidence to estimates that were never precise to begin with. That cognitive reality explains some variance. But there's another side to this. When accounts change in ways that materially reorder events, for example, shifting who was outside and who was inside, or whether someone checked a specific door. Those revisions can alter investigatory emphasis. They can change who investigators would re-interview for alibi corroboration, which yards or creek beds to search again, or which vehicles to retrace. That's why public attention zeroes in on these variations, and why skepticism grows when a witness's story moves between interviews in ways that narrow or widen a critical missing interval. Media coverage and independent online analysts have highlighted these timeline differences repeatedly, compiling clips and transcripts and flagging where minute counts or described sequences differ. For investigators, each discrepancy is a prompt to test, to compare phone records, porch cam timestamps, or witness recollections that might either corroborate or contradict the revised timelines. Crucially, changing a reported time by 3 minutes is not automatically proof of deception. It can be the product of trauma, stress, or simple human error. But when those inconsistencies pile up and interact with other unusual behaviors or omissions, the aggregate effect creates real credibility problems in public perception and, potentially, in legal scrutiny. That is why the pattern of shifting minutes in Candus's accounts has been both newsworthy and consequential. It forces investigators to return to basic verification work, and it forces the community to contend with the hard, discomforting fact that memory and accountability are not the same thing. Her emotion response during interviews appears unusually calm, detached, and rehearsed. Public reaction to a parent's emotional tone in the wake of a disappearance is always raw and complicated. People expect deep, visible distress, tears, shaking, frantic questioning. And when those cues are missing or muted, observers often experience cognitive dissonance. In Candus's case, a recurring critique from commentators and some behavior analysts is that her emotional presentation in interviews seems unusually controlled, almost flat, rather than the anguished, overt grief the public expects. Some viewers describe her effect as calm to the point of detachment, and others characterize parts of her testimony as rehearsed, as if responses were prepared in advance rather than emerging spontaneously. That perception has fed online suspicion, with critics arguing that a natural, raw grief response would look different. Supporters caution that trauma can express itself in many ways, including emotional numbing, dissociation, or focused matter-of-fact statements as a coping mechanism. Behavioral scientists and interview specialists stress two related points that matter here. First, there's a real phenomenon called affective numbing where, after a traumatic shock, some people temporarily shut down their emotional display as a protective function. That can look like calmness to an outside viewer. Second, the compressed and artificial environment of mass media interviews, lights, cameras, structured questions, often elicits a different outward effect in private, behind closed doors grief. A person who is overcome with private despair might present calmly on camera because cameras impose a different psychological framework. Both those facts explain why tone can be misleading when presented to millions of viewers who have never shared the private suffering at hand. But the counterargument is also worth noting. Trained body language analysts and some commentators observe micro-inconsistencies between words and nonverbal behavior in several public appearances. For instance, when describing alarm or urgency, some analysts expect certain physiological markers, vocal pitch variation, facial microexpressions, or involuntary gestures that appear absent or incongruent in recorded clips. Those observations have fed a narrative that her effect is not merely a natural coping strategy, but possibly a consciously modulated performance. This position, loud in online comment sections, has in turn pressured journalists and investigators to take these cues seriously and to examine whether behavioral idiosyncrasies correlate with factual inconsistencies or omitted details. The complex truth is that emotional displays are not reliable evidence by themselves. They are a prompt, not a verdict. Investigators will sometimes use observed emotional responses to guide follow-up. If a witness shows unusual calm when discussing a specific topic, detectives may probe that topic more deeply request corroboration, or re-examine timelines associated with the moment. But courts do not convict on tone alone, and ethical reporting requires caution. Public viewers should not substitute gut impressions for verified facts. Still, because the case already rests on sparse physical evidence, these emotional readings matter in the court of public opinion. And sometimes they shape investigative priorities because they highlight areas where the second look. Behavioral experts note inconsistencies between her words and body language, suggesting possible deception. Across a range of interviews and media appearances, various analysts, some with formal behavioral analysis credentials and others self-styled on social platforms, have pointed out mismatches between what Candus says and how she appears non-verbally. Observers highlight examples where her words express concern, while facial microexpressions or hand gestures signal a different emotional state, or where alleged spontaneous recollections look practiced. Those observations are often repeated and amplified in online compilations and commentary threads that pull clips together to show perceived contradictions. It's essential to differentiate between professional behavioral analysis and armchair interpretation. Professional analysts will document specific, repeatable markers and place them in context with known psychological responses to trauma, cognitive load, or deception. For instance, a common professional observation is that deceptive answers sometimes correlate with microexpressions of contempt or disgust that leak despite overall composure. Similarly, cognitive load, the mental effort required to fabricate detail, can result in speech hesitations or unnatural phrasing. But professionals also caution that these markers are probabilistic, not deterministic. They can raise suspicion, but not serve as proof. They must be combined with corroborating evidence, timestamps, physical traces, or independent eyewitnesses, before conclusions are drawn. Online communities, by contrast, frequently display montage analyses that select moments appearing suspicious and present them as pattern evidence. This produces a feedback loop. Viewers see a curated selection of odd moments and treat them as forensic revelation. Investigators, who must operate within legal and evidentiary frameworks, remain cautious. They might take such compilations as leads to re-interview or as a reason to re-examine recorded statements under scientifically controlled conditions, but they will not treat them as dispositive without additional confirmation. That said, the persistence of behavioral critiques has practical consequences. If multiple independent analysts flag the same verbal-nonverbal mismatches in repeated interviews, detectives may decide to obtain or revisit unedited interview tapes, speak with the interviewer about question phrasing and context, and consider psychological expertise in planning follow-ups. In other words, behavior observations can catalyze investigative steps, but only by prompting verification, not by replacing it. The message is straightforward. Human behavior offers signals, not answers, and the weight those signals carry depends on what other, verifiable facts can confirm or refute them. The secluded property makes a silent, random abduction highly improbable. Ben Hill Road and the surrounding property where the Wells family lived are rural, wooded, and by many accounts, relatively secluded. That landscape is important because it changes the calculus of how an abduction might occur and where evidence would be left. If a stranger had suddenly approached and taken a child without being noticed, the question becomes, how, practically, could that have happened without leaving visible traces in the yard on paths, or with other observers noting a vehicle? In many missing child investigations, a stranger abduction is often accompanied by a vehicle sighting, a neighbor's recollection of an unfamiliar person, or physical artifacts, footprints, a toy, or displaced items that suggest an entry or exit route. In Summer's case, the absence of such clear physical evidence is a major reason investigators have kept multiple scenarios open. Rural terrain both conceals and reveals in different ways. Thick underbrush can obscure visual sight lines, but also preserves tracks and scent trails that trained dogs and careful searches can sometimes find. In this case, several searches were mounted with teams trained to pick up such traces, and yet no decisive trail was linked to an outside vehicle or an intruder's path. That lack of evidence has led some experts to argue that a silent, opportunistic abduction by a stranger, one leaving no trace on a quiet rural property, is statistically unlikely. Instead, these experts suggest investigators weigh more heavily scenarios that fit the physical pattern: an accident in hidden terrain, a scenario involving someone familiar with the property who could move without drawing attention, or circumstances in which a child wandered into a hazard. This line of reasoning does not exonerate the possibility of an outside actor, but it does push the inquiry in particular directions. Investigators must balance the probability of various scenarios against the evidence present and absent at the scene. A rural setting makes random abduction difficult to orchestrate cleanly, but not impossible. The absence of physical corroboration thus increases the importance of precise timelines and corroborated witness statements, which is why inconsistencies in family accounts and later rising witness memories have such practical investigatory weight. In short, the property's isolation both demands and constrains a kind of explanations that can plausibly account for Summer's disappearance. It is essential to emphasize that theories are not evidence. The professional responsibility of investigators is to evaluate hypotheses against corroborated facts and to build cases on verifiable links. Yet for the public, theories shape the narrative and influence the kinds of tips people choose to submit. A theory that suggests a vehicle was seen leaves people scanning for license plates. A theory of inside involvement pushes people to recall household interactions. That is why any suggestion that Candus is covering up something darker is consequential. It mobilizes specific kinds of searching and can spark both helpful tips and harmful, unfounded allegations. Because the official record remains inconclusive, the best practical path is methodical. Test each plausible theory in turn. Prioritize leads that offer verifiable anchors and treat speculative claims with caution. This is unsatisfying for the public, who often want definitive answers quickly, but it is the path that leads to legally and ethically sound outcomes. Public scrutiny continues pushing for truth, seeing her confession as fragmented rather than clarifying. The cumulative effect of inconsistent timelines, a muted emotional presentation, behavioral analysis commentary, and social media amplification is that Candus's public statements, including any partial confession, clarification, or new recollection, are often read as fragmented narrative pieces rather than conclusive truth. The public, fatigued by years of uncertainty, reads those fragments as evidence one way or another, yet investigators treat each piece as a potential lead that must be tested. That methodological divide between public narrative and investigatory process fuels tension. Communities want answers now. Detectives must build them carefully. Despite the frustration, the practical takeaways remain stable. A truthful, reliable account tends to be stable over time or to improve in precision when corroborated by other records. Emotional neutrality can be explained by trauma, but can also mean rehearsed control. Secluded properties lower the probability of clean stranger abduction without trace. Social media can both create new witnesses and produce noise that obscures usable leads. And perhaps most important, justice in a missing person case depends on converting human memory into corroborated fact, not on the volume of online suspicion. If you have specific, verifiable information about June 15th, 2021, a time-stamped photo, a vehicle description, or a first-hand observation tied to a date and place, report to official investigators. Authorities continue to urge tips through formal channels. Those are the pathways that yield evidence admissible in court. The family, the community, and the investigation all need concrete, corroborated information more than they need speculation. Wrap up why this matters and what to do next. Candus's shifting timelines, constrained effect, and public contradictions have done something important. They force a conversation that investigators, the family, and the community cannot ignore. Yet it's crucial to keep the conversation anchored to evidence. Human behavior is complex, memory is fragile, and social platforms are noisy. For real progress, claims must be tested, timelines rechecked against phone and camera records, and statements corroborated by independent witnesses or physical artifacts. Public scrutiny has value when it surfaces new witnesses. It becomes harmful when it substitutes accusation for verification. If you remember anything from the night of June 15th, 2021, or possess verifiable information, timestamps, photos with metadata, vehicle descriptions, contact the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation or local law enforcement. Be specific. Be factual. Avoid speculation. The single detail that solves a cold case often arrives from an ordinary person who, finally, decides to speak and provide a checkable fact. That is the civic action that bridges rumor and resolution. We will continue to follow developments closely. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell to receive verified updates as investigators release them and as responsible reporting sheds new light on this heartbreaking case. Persistent, careful public engagement, not rumor or hysteria, is the only reliable path to justice for Summer Wells and a closure for the people who still wait.